Okay, Jamaa. So today is going to be our last lecture together, and we will be talking about speech and language. And ultimately, we'll start kind of discussing the ideas of how does that happen in the brain, where in the brain, what particular parts, what particular functions, what particular circuits. How can we actually think about that in the context of clinical medicine, clinical neurology? كيف ممكن نفكر في هذا الكلام من ناحية lateralization, hemispheric inputs, and so on. But before I go there, any questions? وداد سألت سؤال عن basic ganglia and disorders. And again, if it's a short answer, I'll be happy to answer it now. If it's more detailed, please go back to the lecture. If it's not there, email me, okay? Again, I'll be more than happy to answer anything that you want. And I've been responding to emails, yani, if you saw that. So anybody who emails me anything that you don't understand, but given that you actually watch the lecture first, لأنه إذا الإشي موجود في lecture, I'll refer you back to it. No, that's your job, okay? You need to put some effort. But before that, like other than that, if there are any questions about any other topics, about this topic, about, you know, a kind of pressing question that you have about other materials, please ask now, or stop me at any point in the lecture. Okay. Why is language important? We want more interactive, you know, session today. It's a fun topic to discuss. So let's make it fun, okay? And let's talk about what this actually means and entails. Why is it important? Why should we care about learning about language? Why should we even care about, you know, the whole concept of, you know, of speech?
Communication.
So Taima is telling us communication. Only communication, Taima?
زي learning about cultures إذا بدنا نروح هناك أو communication between humans.
So communication between humans, history, you know, tales, stories, emotions. This is actually what language is, in a sense. And we can convey a lot of things with written and with spoken language and with seen language, in a sense. And ultimately, it is a means of communication, which is the simplest, most, you know, exclusive definition of language. بس هل الحيوانات عندها language؟
ممكن نعتبر إنه بس مش بالcomplexity تبعت language تبعت humans. أنا مثلا النحل بعمل they have special dances for communicating with each other بس مش بالضرورة زي our language but they have their own language.
So what is our language in this kind of sense, Manato? How can we differentiate our language from other types of language? يعني animal language.
زي مثلا إحنا في عنا characters وفي عنا مثلا زي اللغة تبعت الفراعنة they're pictures بس they are still characters فزي بس هم عندهم مثلا حركات أكتر من actual characters أو spoken things.
Thank you, Taima. Yeah, absolutely. So basically, we're talking about you know, multiple aspects of language that would distinguish human language from other types of you know, languages across the animal kingdom. مين تحكي لنا more details? What makes our language different? Taima تحكي لنا في عنا characters, في عنا written language, basically, that makes us you know, different. Is there written language in the animal kingdom? Is there any form of written language in the animal kingdom?
written زي actual characters ما أتوقع بس ممكن زي إذا physical things ممكن إنه مثلا بيحطوا أشياء معينة في محل indicating إنه مثلا في هون أكل there's danger أو
Exactly. Or marking their territory like bears, you know. they claw some trees in order to mark their territories, basically, so that no other bears, and especially male bears, would actually approach that area. So yes, there is written, kind of character language in a sense, but it's not as complex, I agree, but there is actually written language for the for the animal kingdom. What else? شو كمان في أشياء؟ Taima is very active. We need other voices. ولا نايمين يا جماعة؟ أسبوع بيخلص رمضان. So basically you can start waking up again.
الجو شتا دكتور عشان هيك.
الجو شتاء, okay, as well. All right. So just okay. So any other voices, any other opinions? All right, no other opinions. So basically, but please try to be more active, guys. It makes things a lot easier to communicate. Okay, so where in the brain is language represented? So I have no doubt that you heard a lot about Broca's area and Wernicke's area. مين بده يحكي لنا شو الفرق ومش تيمة بين Broca's area and Wernicke's area؟
احكي دكتور؟
تفضل.
البروكاس اريا مسؤول عن الموتور، معناتها مسؤول عن عضلات بتتحكم في التحدث، يعني اللهجه خلينا نحكي. اما اللورنس اريا بتتحكم اللي هي الكلمات، ترتيب الكلمات ومفهوم الجمل والى اخره.
طيب نور, let me challenge what you just said. إذا أنا كان عندي مشكلة في الموتور كورتكس بصير عندي مشكلة في اللانجوج؟
بصير انه بتأتأ، خلينا نحكي، مش انه بالمفهوم الجمله بكون صحيح، ولكن بكون الانسان مثلا بتأتأ او مش مرتب كلماته صح.
بس ممكن تفقد القدرة على الكلام, or actually kind of you have motor inability to express language.
مظبوط.
إذن is it a motor thing in Broca's area?
It's more of coordination للmotor movements.
So
Maybe.
it's basically, it's not the actual motor, it's basically where the motor meets the meaning in a sense, where it's expressed. It's not the actual muscle aspect. If it's the actual muscle aspect, شو بنسمي المشكلة ساعتها؟
paralysis.
Well, إلها اسم paralysis. هذا paralysis في
Aphasia.
facial muscles اسمها dysarthria.
Dysarthria.
Okay, exactly. We call it dysarthria. Dysarthria is different than aphasia or aphasia, okay? When we're talking about aphasia, it's the inability to express language, not because of motor problems, or not only motor problems, but because of loss of function in this particular area that people think it's called Broca's area. We'll talk in more detail. Actually, in one of the additional readings I have for you guys, there is an interesting paper that actually, or maybe I took it out. Maybe it was in the previous years. I'll put it down there. And then ultimately, I want you to take a look at this one paper, which shows you. Let me start with this. Actually, it's really interesting. I want to show you how versatile our processing of languages, and Broca's area and Wernicke's area and so on and so forth. And I want you to see an actual representation of what happens actually in the brain. Maybe I lost the figure here. Let me just go earlier. Okay. So here is a map of what actually is represented in the brain. And then ultimately, as you can see, when it comes to basically different kinds of sensory inputs, different kinds of communications, different kinds of things that are related to the expression of language and the interpretation of language and the understanding of language. And يعني بدي اياكم تشوفوا الالوان, versatility of the colors here. Yes, there are things around Broca's and Wernicke's area, but it's not only there. Okay, let's start with this. I know the rule is that there is no rule in the brain most of the time, and it's to our dismay there. But the reality is, اللي احنا بنحكي عنه هون بنسميه Broca's area with this kind of assertion is not entirely true, to tell you the truth. And this is recent, actually. This is less than 6-7 years ago. So be aware of that. يعني احنا هون للتبسيط بنحكي Broca's and Wernicke's, and you will see now in a set of studies by Penfield what does that actually mean. ولكن نتفق للتبسيط اوكي في عندنا Broca's area وفي عندنا Wernicke's area. How were they discovered؟ كيف احنا عرفنا انه في Broca's area و Wernicke's area؟ او كيف Wernicke وبروكا Carl Wernicke and Philip Broca they identified these areas. يلا يا جماعة شدوا حيلكم. كيف بنعرف؟ go ahead تفضل.
بحكي when the area is injured in function.
Exactly. If there's a disorder, if there's a problem, thank you, Aya. If there's a problem, if there is a disease, if there is a stroke that affected this particular area and it's gone, all right, we will try to see if basically that is related to language or not. كيف نعرف؟ طب Broca's و Wernicke's كيف عرفوا انها هي المناطق اللي صار فيها المشاكل؟ How did they localize?
the EEG while functioning.
This is in the 1800s. They didn't have EEG.
I think إنهم زي كان patients with aphasia وبعدين when they later died they examined the brain autopsy wise ويشوفوا وين الاتروفي إنه زي
Okay.
شافوا ال pattern of aphasia
But before
when
that,
they were
before that, how did they localize the lesions? Before they did the, the post-mortem studies. شغلة بدي إياكم دائما تتذكروها. Clinical examination. Clinical examination, okay? So ultimately you can decide whether there is a sensory or a motor problem. You can decide is it pre-Sylvian or post-Sylvian. Okay, you can decide whether it's pre-central, post-central by doing clinical tests, examining the patient. So ذكروا دائما whenever you encounter something like this, don't start by just ordering an MRI. Get to know your patient. Okay, because Wernicke and Broca got to know their patients, so they came up with this amazing innovation, So this is again a really big reminder for you as doctors to always put your hand on the patient, talk to the patient, do proper neurological and other examinations in order to do this proper localization. So basically we have Broca's area, we have Wernicke's areas, as you can see here, usually 22 is Wernicke's area, Brodmann's 22, and 44, 45 is Broca's area. And then ultimately, this is how it's thought that language is being produced. We can spend some time talking about the building blocks of language. All I want you to know about the building blocks of language is there are things that we call phones, there are things that we call phonemes, there are syllables, there are vowels, there are consonants. And it's a very interesting and intriguing machinery that produces that, especially for us in terms of the human component of it. And each one of what you're saying is contributing to the way that we pronounce, phones and phonemes and form language, and even, sing and produce different kinds of even tones and so on and so forth. So I really urge you to look at this. If you're interested in basically in audiology and understanding how voice is generated, or if you're interested in linguistics and basically especially the field of phonetics. So phonetics is basically how do we pronounce the languages, and the phonetics and phonology, they are two different sciences there that actually relate to that. And then ultimately, but any simple building blocks. Phones and phonemes, okay? Phones are the actual sounds that actually form phonemes, which are the sounds that produce the language. In the English language, for example, we have 40 phonemes in the entire language. Overall, we have 6,000 human languages that, and you can understand and appreciate the diversity that happens as such. How is that produced? Again, I'll leave it to you to kind of think about this as preferred physiology. I don't want to spend time on this. I know there are much more important topics to discuss here in the course of neurophysiology. So in such a case, what we're talking about in terms of Broca's and Wernicke's area is, there is a good summary table in the other chapter I want you to look at. And then we'll talk about a little bit of the development of the language, but maybe in the second part of the lecture. And let me see here. Here it is. Even Broca's and Wernicke's, processing of language, or Broca's area and Wernicke's area, was identified by understanding the deficit that is associated with which region in the brain, using both clinical examination as well as post-mortem studies, mostly post-mortem studies to precisely localize, but mainly clinical examination to initially localize. So Broca's area, شو بنسميها احنا this kind of aphasia or aphasia? Motor, expressive, and then ultimately the area that is affected is the left ولا right يا جماعة؟ وين language processing centers في الدماغ؟ Right ولا left hemisphere?
left.
Always؟
الدومينانت غالبا.
لما نحكي شوي على the whole concept of dominance there, دعاء and Aya and everybody else who answered. But the whole concept of dominance is not really very well understood there in terms of basically language and motor function. ولكن بالlanguage almost always 97% of the cases زي ما نشوف كمان شوي are actually people are left hemisphere dominant or left hemisphere related to the Broca's and Wernicke's function. هل معنى هذا الكلام انه right hemisphere ما لهاش دور في language? What do you think?
لا.
زي ما بتحكي لا. إلها ولا ما إلها؟ إلها. Okay. Okay, we'll talk in a bit actually about this. All right, إذن بناء على الديفيسيت اللي بصير عندنا in these particular regions, we have something that is called Broca's aphasia and Wernicke's aphasia, which actually are differentiated by expressive. Okay, let me actually guide you through them so that you know where they're actually in the chapter. Okay, so they're written here. Please review this text. Okay, motor or expressive aphasia, we call it Broca's. Sensory or receptive aphasia, we call it Wernicke's aphasia. Okay, اتذكروا مثل ما قبل شوي حكينا احنا ونور Broca's aphasia is different than dysarthria. Okay, Wernicke's aphasia is different than dyslexia and dysgraphia, which is the inability to understand reading or understand writing. Okay, or do reading or writing. Got it? Very important, very different things. So, and they have very different pathways in the brain that actually should sufficiently distinguish them. So as such, these are the major types of aphasia. Is it always isolated into Broca's and Wernicke's? Who knows? شو رايكم؟ بناء على just I showed you initially in this paper, Huth et al. 2016. يعني بقدر اجي احكي انه هي بس expressive ولا بس receptive aphasia? Is it ever like this in the brain?
لا.
And why is that?
أنا كلهم بيعملوا interaction مع بعض.
They do a lot of interactions together. It's never localized. We don't even know where Broca's area exactly is. We don't even know where Wernicke's area exactly is in terms of pinpointing. We just know generally how to localize them, but without exactly showing what that means and what that entails. على كل. So that being said, ultimately it was it has been agreed to categorize things, to simplify things for Broca's and Wernicke's aphasias. Well, I can see something else that is actually related to the مثلا the left superior temporal and supramarginal gyri. If this area is affected, then the connection between the Wernicke's and the Broca's area is affected, and therefore we call it conduction aphasia. All right, and then ultimately the speech is fluent, okay, with some defects, and the comprehension is completely fluent, but they cannot repeat anything that you can tell them. So شايفين الفرق بين Broca's aphasia, Wernicke's aphasia, as well as conduction aphasia. So for Broca's, there's problem in speech generation and repetition, لأنه في مشكلة في الجنريشن. In Wernicke's, there is no problem in generation, there is a problem in comprehension as well as repetition لأنه في مشكلة في comprehension. بينما في conduction, generation is not problematic, comprehension is not problematic, but repetition is the problem. بس فرقه بين هذه كمان مرة والدysarthria. It's not dysarthria. طب كيف نفرق بين هاي والدysarthria؟
الديسارثريا بيقدروش أصلا يحكوا صح؟
Precisely. Thank you. There are problems in the three of these. بيكون ليش؟ لأنه بيعرفوش يحكوا. Okay? يعني احنا we think that they have a problem with comprehension and they can't talk, but the reality is that they can talk. They cannot talk. Okay? And there's something else that we call global aphasia. All right? And the global aphasia is basically the three of them. All of them. And this happens with extensive strokes. And then ultimately this is something also called transcortical motor aphasia, and then transcortical sensory. All right, and then ultimately you can see here the difference between the motor component, which again is related to non-fluent explosive language, and then which affects the entire motor component, all right, of the Broca's area, and then the specific Wernicke's area, which is transcortical sensory, is actually what happens in the case of the sensory aphasia in this kind of sense. All right, so these are the main types of aphasia from a neurology perspective. Which ones should you really know very well? The first three, or the first four mainly. Transcortical motor, transcortical sensory, look at them. They're useful to know, all right? But you'll focus on them in neurology. But I think for the purpose of our discussion, we need to know mainly the first basically three, okay? The fourth is no-brainer in this sense. Okay, بناء على هذا الكلام, how does a patient with aphasia present? Okay, so we come here to one of the examples. So the patient says, I am a signal man. Oh, well, again, these words actually, as you can see, were uttered by the patient. And then ultimately, when the doctor asked again, what did you do for a living? They said, a signal man. شو المشكلة هون يا جماعة? What do you see here? The doctor asks a question. The patient answers. Answers correctly. Answers fluently. What do you see? Where the problem is?
non-fluent
تفضل كمان مرة.
non-fluent
Non-fluent. Then what do we call this aphasia?
Broca's
This is Broca's. Okay. Very good. So, and ultimately, and you can actually read. There are many more examples actually on this. You can just take a look at them. Another example. Oh boy, I'm sweating. I'm awful nervous. You know, once in a while I get caught up. I can't get caught up. I can't mention a terapoi. A month ago, quite a little. I've done a lot well. I impose a lot. While on the other hand, you know what I mean. I have to run around, look it over, driven, etc., etc. For me, it sounds like Donald Trump, to tell you the truth, you know, but I think he has aphasia, you know. He has a lot more problems than aphasia, basically, in a sense. So, but what do you think? شو المشكلة باللي سمعته؟
It's fluent, but it doesn't make sense.
It doesn't make sense. It's incoherent. And ultimately, if it's in response to a question, then the person most probably did not understand the question. So it's comprehension aphasia, which is Wernicke's. And these are, basic characteristics of the different types of aphasias. In Broca's, you have like halting, stopping, You keep repeating phrases. There is a problem with the syntax, the structure of the sentences, okay? The grammar is problematic. The structure of the words is problematic, but the comprehension is completely intact. Whereas in Wernicke's, You don't have any problem generating speech. Very little repetition, okay, but it's spontaneous. Adequate syntax, adequate grammar, inappropriate words most of the time as well, because again, the lack of comprehension, and then the comprehension is not intact. And then ultimately بتسألوا يعني you heard the terms لما تسأل حدا سؤال بالشرق وبيجاوبكم في الغرب basically هذا مش بيجاوب في الغرب بيجاوب بكل الاتجاهات basically the patient with Wernicke's area, and you have to pay attention to that to know exactly what's going on. And ultimately whenever you hear a patient saying this, you need to really be able to identify that. Okay, before we go to the lateralization aspect of things, let's talk about development. طيب, how does language develop? Before we go into the right and the left, I just again I want to share just a few things here with you guys. How do infants and then subsequently adults basically start developing speech? And then ultimately, as you can see here, this is for infants, and basically you would basically see how quick this process of development is. And then ultimately you can see that in the first year, within the first 12 months, you can actually, the infant could understand up to 90 words. You can imagine that? أخوة صغار, if they're younger than 1 year of age, you can experiment with this. You can see, actually try to see how much they understand, because again, it's really important to identify this for your ultimate practice of pediatrics and learning about pediatrics. And that's actually something that is really key here to understand what we call developmental milestones. So these are language developmental milestones, and we track them. And if they're not met, we call them developmental delays. And at that point, the kid would ultimately need some form of intervention in order to catch up. But most kids do catch up ultimately, and they don't have any problems in this kind of sense. So what happens in the first 3 months? Babies start actually producing some vowel-like sounds. They start recognizing language at around 6 months. They start detecting stress in particular words at around 8 and 9 months. They start recognizing combinations of different parts of the language at around 9 months. At around 11 months, they cannot. So before 11 months, they can perceive different phonemes in any language that you present to them, especially if it's a foreign language than the spoken language by the parents or the caretakers. And then ultimately, بعد 11 months, they start actually kind of perceiving the ones that are specific to their native language. And as I said, by 12 months, you're talking about 60 to 90 word comprehension. How does this even develop further in subsequent years? And this is the first 3 years, the first the 36 months of age. And then as you can see, by the 15-month milestone, they should start using 2-word combinations or understand 2-word combinations, not using actually. And by 16 months, they should be able to understand up to 200 words. And by 18 months, they need to understand specific orders. If you tell them basically, or word orders, if you tell them specific requests there. By 24 months, 200 to 300 words. There is a problem usually with past tense, future tense around that age, and then ultimately it resolves by it's not a problem, it's actually the development aspect of it. It resolves at around 30 months. And then by the 36-month mark, they're talking adult-like sentences, almost with a 1,000 words repository at their command. So as you can see, there is a build-up aspect of it. There is a development of different kinds of functionalities along these different milestones. They need to be observed and they need to be followed for the developmental well-being of the baby to be, or the infant or the toddler in this kind of case, to be able to be tracked and traced. But ultimately, you see, it's an intriguing process to observe, and an even more intriguing process to study and test and examine. And ultimately, you'll see in terms of again, when you start your pediatrics practice in the clinical years, you will see how important this is. أخذتوا شيء اسمه developmental science انتوا ولا لا يا جماعة؟ ولا بس embryology؟
لا بس أخدنا زي normal development I think زي امتى بيبدوا يزحفوا يحكوا يتعرفوا على أهلهم بس هذا basics.
I see. So this is certainly much more detailed, but it's really, really important for you to kind of, basically understand how this, how this entails, the different aspects of things. Taima, go ahead. You have a question.
بدي أسأل for people on the autism spectrum من ناحية إنه they are زي low needs, low on the spectrum, they can produce speech and they can understand speech, بس في عندهم مشكلة زي من ناحية understanding في عندهم literal thinking, they don't understand زي مثلا it's raining cats and dogs, they take it literally, وبعدين زي in speaking they have like monotone, so they don't like have different زي using their
colors.
speech. Yeah.
Color. Yeah.
فإيش اللي يسوي؟
As we discussed earlier, بالنسبة autism spectrum disorder, excellent question. Actually, it's mostly related, a very high percentage, almost in the 90s, in the higher 90s percentage of people with autism spectrum disorder or disorders, actually, they have speech impairment. And this actually comes from, nobody knows why exactly, why this happens physiologically, what's kind of, or the pathologically, how does this actually happen in the brain, in a sense? A lot of people attribute this to one of two processes, either the extensive connectivity that is present in the brain and the lack of pruning. ما في عندنا تقليم للspines تصير في الدماغ. And this actually could be attributed basically from a behavioral perspective, often from a molecular perspective, to a misbalance of something that we call neurotrophic factors, growth factors inside the brain that are imbalanced, and some of them, promote extensive growth of these particular spines and so on and so forth. But ultimately, for high functioning ASD, before going there, for low functioning ASD, the problem is they acquire some of these skills and they lose them. Okay. So we call it regression of particular milestones most of the time, or they never develop them. So these are two scenarios for that. But for high functioning ASDs, it's actually related to one of the major symptoms of ASDs, the ones that you mentioned, Taima. One is called stereotypy. Stereotypy is basically repetition of the same particular pattern, and then ultimately being unable to kind of break the cycle, in a sense. So if you think of this as in the context of language, then language becomes more of, conditioned behavior to these individuals, in a sense. All right. So it's not actually the color and the expressiveness and the versatility of language. It becomes more of very trained patterns, again, stereotypy, that ultimately leads to this, inability to understand outside the context, because that could be very stressful to a high functioning patient with ASD. Or basically putting color, because again, there is an emotional dysregulation aspect of things when it comes to ASD, and again, completely and immediately related and connected to this, aspect of stereotyping. Okay, Taima, does this answer your question?
Yeah. إنه ما في أي فكرت إنه زي في throughout the development say journey of an infant, say the infants without ASD require these, and those who have it they don't. بس لا.
No, it's not exactly that. It's much more complex. You see, it's more of ultimately they develop the use for them, but not through what we call normal, basically routes. But they don't you can acquire language as what we're talking about here in this particular set of steps, or you can acquire it by particular behavioral training that actually makes it, get processed through other pathways that are related to habits. We talked about them actually, you see.
Yeah.
So it's either this or the behaviorism component of things. Actually, now that you mention it, there was a big discussion in the 50s and 60s between B.F. Skinner and Noam Chomsky. One is the father of behaviorism, and the other is the father of language theory, in the context of trying to understand, is language a trained behavior, or is it something completely different? طبعا B.F. Skinner is a big proponent of the behavioral explanation of language acquisition, while Chomsky is a big proponent of something completely different related to how we acquire language, as grammar and syntax and rules and other things. And the reality is it's a bit of both. Okay, so there is the whole behavioral aspect to it, there is the whole distinctive language aspect to it, but I think it all breaks to some kind of key universal rules that would be followed in this kind of context. Okay. Okie doke. So let's go back here and we'll start talking about Roger Sperry and what he did, and then we'll stop and then we'll continue after the break. إذن طب كيف بدنا نأكد إنه في عنا lateralization when it comes to language processing؟ بدنا طريقة اللي نقدر نحكي فيها إنه this is the right hemisphere functioning independently from the left hemisphere. مين بيعرف what was that for Roger Sperry? He got the Nobel Prize in 81, by the way, for that. تايمة تفضلي.
He basically studied patients that they went for treatment for epilepsy. The procedure required they basically split the brain. So there's
doing
no
what?
connection. They splitting the anterior commissure or corpus callosum.
Anterior commissure, corpus callosum are cut so that there is no communication between the two hemispheres and therefore no generalized seizures, in a sense. Thank you. Exactly. And they used to be called split brain patients. Very infrequently this is used these days. And then ultimately شو بيعمل هذا الكلام؟ طب احنا if I cut the corpus callosum and anterior commissure, I get this picture, and then ultimately the visual cortices on the right and left, they don't talk to each other. Anything that you see in the left, basically in the left visual field, the vector visual system, this is processed in the temporal visual field, مظبوط? Or temporal or nasal visual field. What do you want to tell me here? ذكروا معي. This is the nasal or the temporal visual field for me.
Temporal.
This is a temporal visual field which would be processed in which part of the the optic nerve?
The nasal.
Okay, so this is basically the nasal component, the optic nerve in this kind of sense. And then ultimately it's going to be processed in which part of the other optic? The temporal. So the temporal on the left or the right is going to be nasal on the corresponding side and temporal on the contralateral side. نرجع كمان مرة للاناتومي. النيزل والtemporal بيروحوا على أي جهة؟ بيروحوا على الtemporal other hemisphere against this. Okay? إذا أنا عندي split brain and they don't talk to each other. الأشياء اللي في left visual field أو في right visual field بدهم يروحوا اللي في right visual field بيروح على left hemisphere وفي ال left visual field okay بدي يروح على right hemisphere, right? You agree? مش راح in split brain patients it will not cross to the other side لأنه we cut the connection. إذن this actually gave Sperry and other colleagues a very rare opportunity to study what happens in these patients for language processing. So if I put something in their, again, right visual field, this will get processed where? In their left hemisphere. Got it? And this basically would tell us the left hemisphere function, as opposed to putting something in their left visual field and gets processed in the right hemisphere. شو اللي لقيوه Roger Sperry and others? So what they found is, again, if they put something in the right visual field, gets processed by the left hemisphere. you can name the object. If they put something in the left visual field, you cannot actually name it, but you can basically describe it and give it color and give an emotion aspect of it. What was the conclusion? Language processing for naming things, particularly, okay, was preserved in the left hemisphere in 97% of the cases. All right. While the right hemisphere, is it actually involved in language? The answer is yes, but something completely different, which gives the color and the emotion of the language. This is summarized here, as you can see. And then ultimately, it gives another set of functions. Stereogenesis, okay, for the right hand or the left hand. If you actually don't see the thing in your left or right visual field, if you just touch it, then you can form, again, language description of it based on the spatial aspect of it using the right hemisphere, but actually name it based on the left hemisphere. Okay? واضح يا جماعة experiment? Benefiting from this split brain ability or split brain case of patients, Roger Sperry and others managed to localize language production. Very easy, very simple. And again, it got them a Nobel Prize in this field. Okay, this actually spurred a lot of discussion in terms of language and handedness. And then as such, it was thought of as basically, even هل معنى إنه I am left hemisphere dominant for the language that actually this relates in any way to handedness, to which hand I use to write, and basically which leg I use to shoot the ball, مثلا? The answer is not really. It's basically, they're not related. Your handedness is almost completely independent. What you observe in right-handed people in terms of the left hemisphere dominance for language processing, 97% also exists in left-handed people. Okay, only 3%, and it's apparently equally represented in the right-handed versus left-handed aspect of things. Is only this kind of 3% that where people are actually processing language in their right hemisphere, not left hemisphere. I mean, language by meaning by Broca's and Wernicke's here doesn't necessarily mean that the right hemisphere in 97% of people is not doing anything. And there are things about left-handedness that actually you see it's associated with pathological problems. This is basically, again, an inference. It's a correlation, not a causation aspect of things. So don't take it with a grain of salt, please. Okay, so that's not entirely. I don't think it's true. على كل. Okay, let's stop here, guys, and we'll resume in the next part of the lecture in 10 minutes. Before we stop, any questions about the topics that we covered so far? Lateralization, processing of language, what language is, aphasias, different symptoms. أنكم فاهمين كل شيء. I hope. Okie doke. So no questions. We'll stop here. Now let's come back in 10 minutes at the beginning of the hour to resume discussion about the physiological basis for language generation. We'll see you in a bit. Okay, guys, we'll get started in a minute. Meanwhile, if anybody has any questions, please feel free to ask.
دكتور أنا عندي سؤال
تفضل يا go ahead.
شو اللي بحدد الهانددنس؟
اللي بيحدد الhandedness is a lot of things actually. Some people say it's genetic. Some people say that actually it's environmental. If you have a left-handed person, I like to think it's a mix of both. You need to have like a predisposition genetically, and actually see somebody using their left hand. And basically the way that the brain is wired is extremely different, very different in a sense. Actually, the way that they write, the way they use different tools shows you that it's not just environmental. There's some basically biological compositional component to it. And في حالات اسمهم ambidextrous, by the way. They can use both hands. So again, it's not clear, to tell you the truth, what really decided handedness. To the best of my knowledge, of course, maybe there's something new, I don't know. بس يعني ما في, let me call it consensus or convention. ما في اصطلاح في الفيلد the neuroscience, and handedness happens because of this or that pathway in the brain. Okay, دعاء?
أوكي شكرا.
Sure. هيا تفضلي.
دكتور، يعني في التجربة السابقة اللي شرحتها الشخص مثلا لما بيشوف اوبجكت بزاوية معينة ما بيقدر يسميه، بس مثلا إذا غير زاوية نظره بيقدر يسميه.
إذا هلا شوفي كيف شو اللي بنعمله هون آية. بدك أولا هدول patients عندهم split brain. نتفق إنه they're focusing at a fixation point in the middle. بعدين أنت شايفي كيف يعني إحنا how do we examine the visual field؟ بنحكي للشخص يركز على نقطة في in the center of the visual field. بعدين we start putting things in their visual field, So it's not إنه بغير نظره. No. They're fixated. بس إحنا we put things in their visual field. Got it? And then ultimately بنحطه في right visual field. If we split هيك and into half, this is the right and left visual field. And then ultimately we place things in the, it's my right actually, but it's your left, basically you see it in the left, or the left visual field, which is your right. What you see here is right. Okay. So in a sense, احنا ما نطلب من الشخص يحرك شيء. Fixate, we place the objects in their visual fields. Okay. And then ultimately إذا نحطه في right, في split brain, it will be processed on the left hemisphere. إذا نحطه في left, it's processed on the right. Got it?
شكرا. طب والميموري مثلا تلعبش دور مثلا إنه يقدر يسمي الأوبجكت، ولا هو completely ما بيقدر يعملها؟
Absolutely. بس إنه الميموري مثل شايفة قطعنا الكوربوس كالوسوم، لو بدي أجي أربطها أنا الليفت مع الرايت hemisphere، عرفتي كيف؟ Apparently it's stored in different places. You see? So that's why you cannot really, actually let me correct that. In order for you to retrieve the memory, if you're processing things on the right hemisphere, you need to have access to the left processing centers on the left hemisphere to talk to memory, you see?
Thank you.
But you don't have any problem in describing the object. But you have a problem naming it. Got it?
Yes, thank you.
And كأنه في layer مش موجودة. Okay, sure. Any other questions? And left-handed people, don't worry. You'll not die young. Actually, this doesn't necessarily mean that. The maximum, take this with a grain of salt. It doesn't necessarily mean that this is again what we call correlation, and correlation does not imply causation. Okay. And because it's like a very small percentage of people is left-handed, it's significantly an undersampling problem. Okay. Or an oversampling of the right-handed people. Who's here ambidextrous? Who uses both hands? Actually, من الموجودين هون حاليا. Anybody? عندنا 154 شخص in this lecture room now. How many people use both hands? Just raise your hand. Do the raise hand function. How many are left-handed? اللي سامعيني. Just do the Zoom raise hand if you can hear me. إذا منتبهين أصلا يعني. Nobody is left-handed. معقول يا جماعة. Okay, apparently you're not listening. على كل. So let's continue this. Unless anybody else has any other questions, you can stop me. So basically, the Sperry studies spurred a lot of interest, actually, in terms of the localization and anatomical differences between the hemispheres. ليش left hemisphere? Why does that happen? What kind of supports that? Why Broca's and Wernicke's areas? And what kind of anatomy and physiology support these processes? And this actually led to a very interesting discovery in the 60s, which actually to some extent even predated Sperry and his experiments, by basically Geschwind and his colleagues at Harvard Medical School. They discovered something that is called a planum or a planum temporale. And this area, it exists in 2/3 of people. And actually, it's mostly much larger in the left side, in the left hemisphere. And apparently, as you can see, it's very clearly, close to both, the Broca's and the Wernicke's areas in the temporal lobe, in this sense. But ultimately, it didn't really, it did not have any kind of functional aspect functional significance to it. Although, as an anatomical observation, it's extremely interesting and exciting. Okay, but it's just worth mentioning at this point. And also, that actually kind of explains a lot of these asymmetries that you see between the right and the left temporal lobes. Other approaches were used to map language functions onto different aspects of, basically the hemispheres. Another test that was developed by John Wada at the Montreal Neurological Institute, MNI. It's a very famous thing, actually, that we use in neurology, and it's a very famous institute in neurology. Anybody who uses MRIs or fMRIs will know this very well, actually. So what was the WADA test? Basically, in order to deactivate the left hemisphere, WADA would actually inject in the left carotid an anesthetic, and this particular anesthetic would potentially, the left carotid, anesthetize the left hemisphere. If we anesthetize the left hemisphere, شو اللي بصير لنا؟ مين بده يحكي لي؟ What do we lose?
Language will speech.
Completely language. Broca's ولا Wernicke's? تنتين. Exactly. So, what happens if we anesthetize the right hemisphere? شو اللي بنخسره؟
ability to say نقول إنها طابة بدل ما إنها إشي دائري لونه أحمر.
Precisely, to describe the objects and to put color on the language and to describe the emotion related to the language. Okay, so that's actually something that you would lose with a WADA test. Of course, it's not very common, like it's not used at all. Not nowadays. The test, it's very dangerous. It was in the 60s. It was very dangerous to do this in healthy subjects, and you can cause a lot of problems with an anesthetic injection in the brain. Unless it's needed, of course, we do this still in some neurosurgical, basically neurosurgical patients before the surgery to assess functionalities. وهي الأيام we don't actually need to do that لأنه we have fMRIs, we have PET scans, we have transcranial magnetic stimulation (TMS). You can actually make somebody lose their language abilities by putting a coil on their head and stimulating. Okay. And هون عم بعمل my right hand and right brain, but basically it should be your left side. Okay, you should see this on my left side. So that's actually how you impair somebody's ability to express language or comprehend language, just using a coil, magnetic stimulation. Okay, so who needs to inject somebody's carotid with anesthetics? So that's actually how it happens. ولكن this actually kind of spurred another interesting question. نحكي على hemispheres, but we didn't really get to the point that Broca and Wernicke described. Where is Broca's area? Where is Wernicke's area? This is actually the work of a brilliant neurosurgeon in the 30s. His name is Wilder Penfield, again, at the Montreal Neurological Institute, that they carried out what we call localization studies. مين بعرف؟ زي برودمان. شو عمل برودمان؟ ليش بنسميهم برودمان areas? We call this the Penfield map actually. حكينا عن الموضوع سابقا. ليش بنخلي البيشنتس صحيين خلال النيوروسيرجريز؟
to observe إيش إنه مثلا لما نعمل stimulation لمنطقة معينة what's the effect on them.
Precisely. شو عملنا هون يا تيمة؟
Localization.
عملنا stimulation هاي المنطقة وهم صاحيين شفنا شو الإفكت على language. If we stimulate that particular area, do we impair language function? What kind of language function? Is it expressive? ولا sensory? Or receptive? Okay? بناء على هذا الكلام, as you can see here, all of these areas represented something similar to Broca's aphasia, while these areas represent something that's similar to Wernicke's aphasia. Got it? داخل الدائرة بشوفوا عدد ال patients that were tested and expressed something similar to Wernicke's function or Broca's function. And the largest number that you can see there is almost 79 patients in this particular area, not even close to Broca's. And for here, we're talking about 36, basically in matching what we call Wernicke's area, but طبعا Wernicke's area is much more elongated than Broca's area. Then where is Broca's area? What's the simple answer based on this? It varies. Subjective. Okay. كمان مرة اللي سأل عن سؤال كيف بتطور هذا الكلام in individuals, as you can see here, maybe even brothers and sisters are different. Okay. كيف الhandedness بتطور. And accordingly, each one of us is, an independent individual story apparently. And there is no rule when it comes to how language develops. And I would imagine the handedness actually carries something very similar. Type. And again, using some of these new techniques, PET scans here in particular and fMRI, what you will see is what we do in PET scans and fMRI, بنحط البيشنت في السcanner, and we have them actually do a task, play a game, or answer questions while they're in the scanner. They look at a screen through a particular set of lenses and a particular set of mirrors, and you can actually make them see whatever you want and answer questions using a microphone. And then ultimately, as you can see in this kind of PET scan here, let me actually make it smaller so that you can see the whole thing. If we just ask them to passively view the word, شو بتتوقعوا يصير؟ Sensory effect. وين؟ في visual field, في visual cortex, occipital cortex. If we ask them to listen to a word, we ask them to comprehend, understand the language. Then we will be in Wernicke's areas territory. إذا بنسأل نطلب منهم يحكوا الكلمة, express the word, we're talking about Broca's area. And again, قارنوا في Broca's area أو في السنتر اللي هون شايفينه إحنا, what we call Broca's area here. Okay? So very different realities. But again, data are data, this is evidence. And when we ask them to generate word associations, إذا حكينا لهم إذا شفتوا table, tell me the word chair. We call this bird associate test in cognitive science. There is a kind of crossplay between Wernicke's and Broca's areas, in a sense. Actually, حتى not Broca's area in this kind of sense. You see, it's a little bit down there. Got it? This is what we call a PET scan. Positron emission tomography. And there are many examples on this in terms of the studies that you can actually look at. I'll leave it to you to navigate this, and then ultimately see what that means. And then ultimately, even more than that, if we try to categorize different words, do different word categories excite different brain areas? The answer is yes. And actually, there is a big discussion مثلا في autism. You were asking a lot about autism, about something called the face fusiform area, the FFA. The face fusiform area as being the area in the brain in the basically the visual processing areas that is very important for processing faces. But here, similarly, we have particular areas that are important for processing categories of particular words. The names of tools, the names of people, the names of animals. بعرفش إذا مرة سمعتوا أو قرأتوا عن مثلا the Jennifer Aniston neuron in the hippocampus مثلا, okay? In a particular rat, you know. Every time there was the picture of Jennifer Aniston, it would fire for some reason, you know. And then ultimately, something very similar in this kind of sense. So you see these kind of interesting associations that emerge based on a rule, based on a category. Do they hold across subjects? Not all the time, I can tell you that. And this is based on the work of the two Damasios. You can look it up. It doesn't really hold with all of this variability. And again, every time you have any doubts about what this means, go back to this Nature paper, and it shows you, you know, how variable this function is, how versatile this function is, where we don't even know what this actually entails. We don't even know where to start. And if there are actually governing rules or laws or not, it's a lot to comprehend. Okay, so what's the role of the right hemisphere? Any questions so far before I move forward? Probably will finish early today, so there will be a chance to ask questions if you want. But please stop me before, you know, it's while we're talking about the topic, so that we can dig a little bit deeper. What's the role of the hemisphere, or the right hemisphere, in generating language? مثل ما اتفقنا, it's important for the description of the object, for the color of the language, for the stresses on particular syllables or particular vowels, for basically how you put an emotional tone aspect of it, okay? And then ultimately, what does that entail in terms of expressing language? And there are a lot of things that you need to, for example, pay attention to. If you speak Chinese, for instance, and you look at the meaning of the word ma, it could have 4 or 5 different different meanings, depending on how you pronounce it, okay? Could be what, could be mother, it could be something as basically agreeing with something, and so on and so forth. So that being said, you know, the right hemisphere is not completely, you know, useless when it comes to language. It's actually very important. And potentially for Taima, you asked about ASD, this could be actually something that is related to ASD, which is the right hemisphere involvement in the production of language. ولكن it's not just that, it's the whole behavioral aspect of how language is acquired in these patients as opposed to the rest of the population. There are some genetics correlates that relate to the, you know, development and expression of language. I'm not going to tell you that it's very, you know, clear. There are very isolated cases in this kind of context. There is a FOXP2 gene, probably you read about it somewhere, and there's this family, but this family that actually expressed this particular gene, they're not just language impaired. They have mental retardation, they have intractable epilepsy, they have a lot of other problems, they have low IQs. So apparently it's not just one thing that is related to the expression of one of these, you know, neurotrophic factors that we call them. And then ultimately, it's not a very clear kind of association. But if you find something that is like a generalizable dysfunction, then you might actually think about the FOXP transcription factor, I'm sorry, as a potential you know, culprit when it comes to these developmental delays. Go ahead, تفضلي تيمة.
سؤال بالنسبة لل people who speak more than one language.
Yep.
في كتير studies عمالها بتحكي إنه زي they tend to choose not their like native language when speaking about things that are hard because it's detached from them, kinda. It's easier to talk about it not in your native language. فهل هذا له علاقة في right hemisphere?
Possibly, but I'm not sure there is lateralization when it comes to you know, multilingual people. I'm not exactly sure, because if you think about the acquisitions, it should be similar, the similar left hemisphere dominance aspect of it. But in terms of preference, and if you multiple things that you could think about, in terms of what kind of language you use to think about things, what language do you dream in? Okay, is it a native language or a second language? When did you acquire the second language or the third language? And then ultimately, as such, there is no clear rule when it comes to any of these things. So that's the simple answer again. And ultimately, so what does that mean? You know, even if somebody uses like other language in order to process things, what does that entail from a functional perspective? Does that make them think better, think faster, think more efficiently? I'm not sure about that either. Okay, so there are a lot of problems in this kind of way of thinking about things. And that's actually what's called social neuroscience, and the experiments are not very well demarcated. Okay, Taima? إلهام تفضلي.
دكتور بالنسبة لي حكاته تيمة أنا برضه حضرت زي نوع من الفيديوز إنه بتحكي إنه بسبب إنه الشخص تعرف على أكتر من مفردات أو أكتر باللغة الثانية إنه مش النيتيف لانجويج تبعته صار قادر إنه خصوصا إلها العلاقة بالمشاعر زي إنه عرف مثلا depression مثلا بالنسبة للإنجليزي زي depression وanxiety ويعرف أكتر بالمعاني هدول صار قادر إنه يتعرف على مشاعره ويحكي بهاي القصص إنه بالإنجليزي خصوصا لما يعبر عن أي شيء مضايقه ففي شوي من القصة موجود إنه صح.
No, absolutely. بس شايفي هون basically it's what we acquire. It's not about the language. يعني لو تعلمنا الاشياء بالعربي، اوكي، لو حدا دارس طب في سوريا مثلا وتعلموا كل هذه الاشياء بالعربي، لو يسمع depression في الانجليزي والanxiety في الانجليزي it doesn't mean anything to them, right? You see my point?
دكتور.
So it's not necessarily the language, it's more of what do you learn? How do you acquire it? It's not about your native language versus a second language. يعني لو اجى حدا native speaker of English وعلمناه الطب بالعربي, when you say اكتئاب أو توتر, they will relate to them and think about them بالعربي لأنه they read the text بالعربي. Okay? Inshallah, basically, you know, people would start learning Arabic so that you could actually understand science. I don't know, it's an, big hope. It used to be this case, by the way, في أيام الأندلس الناس اللي كانوا يجوا من أوروبا يدرسوا في الأندلس كانوا يضطروا يحكوا عربي. يضطروا يتعلموا عربي مشان to actually kind of speak the language of science in these days. اليوم أكيد لا للأسف, basically. So that's we need to work on that, guys. All right. So as such, where was I? I lost my train of thought. So as such, what we're talking about here is related to, genes and language, and this very interesting association. But again, it's not just language; it's a lot of other developmental aspects of things. Another really intriguing topic is sign language. Before we go there, مين بده يتوقع sign language learning والacquisition والexpression تبعها similar to regular language ولا لا؟ Yes. So Taima tells us yes. What do others think? طب هم بيسمعوش, they can't hear.
بس مثلا في deaf babies زي deaf from birth زي كيف الأولاد الصغار لما يقعدوا زي يحكوا كلمات زي مش مفهومة برضه هم كمان زي بيستخدموا ايديهم زي كأنهم they babble with their hands فزي أنا طبعا بيكون their parents sign to them مش إنه هيك من العدم يعني بس basically زي precedent ل actual words precedent to actual signs they do that زي نفس ال hearing babies I think it's the same.
Excellent, Taima. طيب كمان مرة I want another smart answer. كيف بدنا نعرف إنه sign language is controlled by similar areas in the brain or not? Using the same logic that we've been talking about for the past hour and 20 minutes. What do you think?
Basically people with defects.
Which means?
And like deaf people who later develop lesions or strokes or something like that, and we
Exactly.
like
Precisely.
observe them.
Exactly. Do we see Broca's aphasia in sign language? Yes. Do we see Wernicke's aphasia in sign language? Yes. Are they related to the same exact general areas in the brain that we're talking about? Yes. Simple. So I'm not going to spend more time on this, discussing the peculiarities of it. But basically, I want you to realize that apparently it's not just spoken language. It could be related to written language, but like in the same thing for blind people happens. Okay, when it comes to their braille way of reading. And then ultimately, so it's not an actual written language, it's more of like a tactile related aspect of language. And then as such, language is not just what's heard, what's seen, written, okay? But it's something that is more like, meta aspect of it. There is a meta aspect of this kind of concept, which is basically communication, So regardless of the sensory modality, if I want to take this a little bit further, whether it's auditory, whether it's visual, whether it's, basically both auditory and visual, طبعا, this significantly increases the features that we can talk about. This does not mean that you lose the basic function, which is related to the left hemisphere and is expressed in what looks like the Broca's area and comprehended by what looks like the Wernicke's area. Sign language and, again, blindness. Also left hemisphere dominance related to that specific language aspect of things. So, again, thanks to Taima, we know now basically that we can observe this again in patients, an older deaf or blind individual who, comes to you with, basically a Broca's-like aphasia or a Wernicke's-like aphasia. Don't ignore examining them. It's always very noble of people who want to learn sign language, of course, basically that's the way you think about it as well. على كل. And then the whole aspect of the babbling for babies is very true, what Taima mentioned. Okay, we've been talking about multilinguals, but until which period of time do we actually lose the ability to acquire a new language? Who knows? إلهام تفضلي.
دكتور أظني لعمر يعني هم بالأغلب الصغار في فيديوز كتير طالعين لبنات إنه صغار 4 سنين تقدر تاخد أكتر من يعني لغات، بس أظن اللغة بتقدر تضلك تكتسبها لحد 7 سنين وبتقدرش كمان إنه تفرق بين إنه زي الأكسنت إنه لا إنه كأنك عادي أنت نيتيف سبيكر لهي اللانجوج، فلحد عمر 7 سنين تقدر تاخد أكتر من لغة. وفي برضه بنت يعني أظن عمرها 4 سنين عندها أخذت 8 لغات إشي زي هيك يعني أكبر، يعني شفت لها فيديو فإنه
Absolutely. So basically, I mean, generally speaking, we're talking about 7 years, but it's probably less, a little bit less than 7 years. And some people say between 2 and 5, actually, in general. That window closes, and some of the windows close as at 1 year زي ما شفنا بالنسبة للforeign language phonemes. تايمة تفضلي.
بس الشغلة إنه زي we don't necessarily like lose our ability to acquire a new language. It just becomes harder, صح؟
We don't acquire them as native languages, okay?
Oh.
So it becomes a second language. They call it second language acquisition and second language speaking, but ultimately, yes, you can acquire it, you can learn it, but you will not really basically, be very proficient in it. You see? You will not speak it as a native speaker. Okay, there is the inverse, where basically, what if somebody does not acquire language? How did we know that actually it's 7 years? There are some horrific cases actually that humans actually did, unfortunately. One lady in Los Angeles basically incarcerated her daughter for 13 years without even talking to anybody. She put her in a cage, literally, okay? And that was in the 70s. Cage meaning a room here, not an actual cage. And ultimately, she didn't want her to make any noises at all. So she would actually kind of really beat her if she made any noises. شو بتتوقعوا هاي البنت كان عندها قدرة to actually acquire any language or not? What do you think?
No, أنا زي 13 years راح الويندو تقدر
So she couldn't
acquire language.
Exactly. Unfortunately, she couldn't really acquire. She acquired very, very few things that are basically related to sign-like language, but not actual language. She significantly lost that ability. And as you can see in this nice figure, it just shows you the significant drop in our ability to acquire languages with age. But ultimately, it's do you acquire it as a native speaker? Is the formative years is up to 2 years, okay, as a native speaker. And then from 3 to 7, you can acquire many new languages, but not necessarily as a native speaker. Okay, and then it declines significantly up until the ages of 40 and beyond. This does not mean that you cannot, okay? This means that, you know, you're talking about the relative fluency in whatever you learn. And people vary significantly when it comes to this. All right, and then ultimately, we'll talk about a few topics, a few other topics. Dyslexias. Dyslexia is generally, what does dyslexia mean? It's actually a very important thing that you need to pay attention to. Yeah.
They have difficulty reading.
So the difficulty reading, we talked a little bit about it, okay? And dysgraphia and dyslexia, كيف نفرقهم عن Wernicke's ولا Broca's؟ مهم نفرق الديسلكسيا والدysgraphia عن Wernicke's ولا Broca's؟
Broca's.
Wernicke's
Wernicke's
نفرقها عن الدysarthria. Okay? Broca's لأنه expressive, motor. We need to distinguish it from other motor problems such as dysarthria. Wernicke's is comprehensive, okay, comprehension related, and therefore we need to distinguish it from things that are related to comprehension because of problems in reading or because of problems in identifying, you know, things. Got it? That's and actually in some, the dyslexia has been shown to be associated with this particular brain area called visual word form area, VWFA. And as you can see, this is basically the left occipital-temporal cortex, and it just shows you that, you know, people basically with you know, with particular problems in the visual word form area have you know, some form of dyslexia, and it's a thing, and you need to identify if you have it. Of course, if you have a problem, you know, reading things as opposed to listening to things, that's actually one of the symptoms, but it's, you know, much more progressive, much more you know, extensive than just you know, these very simple tests that you can do off the internet. I think this is the last topic for our discussion today, and I would like to ask it again. Do other animals, based on what we discussed, do other animals have language? إلهام تفضل.
دكتور ممكن يكون عندهم إنه زي طرق للتواصل مع بعض إنه مختلفة عنا، بس نقدرش أظني نطبق فكرة إنه اللانجوج زي كيف إحنا تعريفها عنا عليهم، إنه زي نقدرش نحكي إنه نقدر نطبق كشرح يعني وكيف إحنا بنحكي اللانجوج تعريفها عنا عندهم، فممكن يكون عندهم زي يعني طريقة معينة زي كيف الأنتس مثلا بتحكي مع بعض أو إنه زي هيك، وهي بتعتبر اللانجوج إنه تبعتهم.
طيب سؤال، يعني إلهام، خلينا نناقش الموضوع من ناحية logic. Do you or do we see something similar to Broca's and Wernicke's areas in animals? What do you think?
صراحة مش عارفة دكتور الصراحة، بس
نستعمل اللوجيك.
يعني
اوكي.
ممكن
بس مش بس ممكن او لا. Did people find or not? And let's use again logic. Did people find Broca's and Wernicke's area in sign language or not?
sign language. Oh,
they did. Sign language, they have no sensory input basically, except for the visual aspect of it. And ultimately, let me show you in the chimps, I think. So there are activation of areas in the frontal and temporal lobes for these rhesus monkeys based on different vocal calls. Something very similar to Broca's and Wernicke's areas. Very similar. But their language, not our language. Okay? It's exactly what Ilham said. It's their language, their way of expressing things, not what we call language. So that's a very important distinction in this kind of context. And as such, it's really key for us to try to understand that, you know, our whole construct of what we call language means that it's our ability to express things, it's our ability to talk about things, it's our ability to write things, it's our ability to express things emotionally and again, you know, linguistically. Animals have languages of their own. And as you can see, there are like, we use symbols to talk to animals. But لما تيجي تشوفوا الstudies say, oh, we can make a monkey do arithmetic or do, you know, paired associates or something similar. It's mostly not actually arithmetic, it's mostly conditioning, similar to what you do with training a dog or training a sea lion or any of that, where it's chaining, ذكروا كيف حكينا chaining, condition stimulus with a particular response, or a discriminative stimulus response, and then you give an outcome, then you chain it with another stimulus, then response, then outcome, and so on and so forth. So mostly animals don't speak our language, they speak their own. They have similar brain regions that govern their own language. And ultimately, that's what you would expect. Okay, Jama'ah, so this concludes our discussion for today. Any questions? We have like 5 or 10 more minutes. If you want to ask any questions, I'll be happy to answer about this topic or any other topics.
دكتور تسمح لي أسأل بس شيء يعني خارج عن المحاضرة شوي.
خلينا نجاوب الأسئلة اللي علاقة أول، بعدين
أكيد.
keep it in your brain, Noor, until we're almost close to finishing, okay?
تمام.
Okay, of course. تيمة تفضلي.
دكتور، من إذا في patient having difficult زي كان قبل عادي بس he's presenting with difficulty retrieving words المفروض يعرفها، فزي basically بيكون عماله بيحكي بس الكلمة بتروح بكل اللغات اللي بيعرفها. هل في سبب معين لهذا الموضوع؟ هل MRI ولا PET scan ممكن يكون أحسن زي evaluate إيش المشكلة؟
How old would be the patient there, Taima, in this case?
Like young.
And are they medical students by any means, basically? So I can diagnose them immediately. It's stress, actually, okay? I can tell you immediately that actually this is stress. By the way, Jama'ah, anxiety can cause things that look like a heart attack, like paralysis,
panic attack,
and any kind of organic problem could be manifested because of anxiety.
Oh, but they're not medical students, so they're not stressed.
So basically, if it's most probably it's usually stress related. If it's not stress related, you need to observe them closely. MRI usually is not indicated unless you see other actual organic things. عرفتوا كيف؟ يعني مثلا weaknesses, changes in muscle symmetry, seizures, different types of abnormal movements مثلا, okay, when it relates to the brain. Forgetting مثلا things that are much more important than just words. Basically forgetting what the day is, what the date is, where they are, what's their name, what the name of people that they know, if their school performance goes significantly down in this sense. All right, so these are other things that you need to pay attention to. Do they interact or socialize with their friends or not? Do they use social media extensively or not? Do they sleep properly? Do they eat properly? Are they using any drugs? All of these are very important factors to pay attention to. بعضهم مخيف, بعضهم عادي, especially if you know the person. So don't think as a relative, think as a doctor, okay? And basically put that layer of protection so that you can think logically about it. But you need to take proper history, do proper exam in order to investigate this properly. Got it, Taima?
Hello.
But in 90% of cases, it's stress. If it's a person, okay? براء.
دكتور بصير بس تروح على صفحة 11.
صفحة 11. Okay, let me see.
هون هدول السيركلز هم عدد البيشنتس اللي عندهم البروكس والبيرنكس areas بهاي المنطقة غير عن المنطقة اللي احنا حاطينها يعني أنا بالفرونتال وبالأوكسيبيتال هيك أو البرايتال.
They showed that all the patients مش وين البروكاز والفيرنيكاز, how many of them showed things similar to Broca's aphasia and Wernicke's aphasia. عرفتي كيف؟
Okay.
So it's not actually localized. In a sense, it is localization of Broca's and Wernicke's. But مشان نكون دقيقين, the experiment was, do they express aphasia-like symptoms or not? You see?
تمام. Thank you.
Absolutely. Any other questions? بتمنى أن يكون كل شيء مفهوم هنا basically. If not, again, we can certainly follow up. Please email me if you have any other questions after you read the material, and I'll be happy to answer. نور تفضل.
دكتور بما انه خلص ما في كمان اسئله، فبدي اسال موضوع اللي هو خارجي شوي عن المحاضره. بدي اسالك دكتور، اخترتوا الاسئله عن الامتحان ولا لسه؟
والله you can communicate with the course coordinator on this aspect, so don't ask me about the questions, okay?
هو الموضوع بخص الفيسيو بشكل خاص، لانه صراحه الماده خلينا نحكي ضخمه. اوكي في الاخر احنا كلياتنا رح نغطيها كلها 100%، ولكن عشان نحكي بانه نغطيها حفظ 100% كل الماده، الموضوع مستحيل. خلينا نحكي خاصه الفيسيو. هيك انا شفت موضوع قبل سنتين، ما بعرف صحته اذا صحيح ولا لا، انك عملت محاضره مراجعه للطلاب، بتكون كخطوه اولى بالمعلومات اللي بتهم الطالب بكلينيكال بالمستقبل، وبخطوه ابعد برضه بتكون قريبه للامتحان اللي تخليه يحفظ مواضيع معينه 100%، وباقي مواضيع يكون مطلع وفاهمها من كويس. فقلت اسالك دكتور اذا ممكن نعمل نفس الحركه لدفعتنا هاي السنه.
I'll be happy to review topics with you guys, بس يعني كمان مرة it's just the issue is أنا حكيتكم very clearly from the beginning. أنا مش راح أحاسبكم، اللي بده يشوفوا يا جماعة باختصار مشان نوفر الوقت على الجميع. لن يرسب إلى المصر على الرسوب في هذه المادة. Okay, let me use this. إذا أنتم مش هون, if the person is not here أو مش سامع أو scrolling through Instagram while they're watching the lecture, or wants to read notes or doesn't want to read the lectures at all, عرفتوا علي كيف؟ أو بدوش يكون حاضر, then yes, this person is at risk. It's a no-brainer. هذا الموضوع يعني بدوش doesn't need anybody with an IQ of 160 to tell you that. Okay, and then ultimately based on that, المادة كلها موجودة in front of you. You just can listen to the lecture, listen to the notes. أنا بعرف إنه أنتم بتاخذوا notes عن بعض. And again, the notes you should see they're very simple, very straightforward. أما إني أنا just to sit down and tell you شو تركزوا عليه وشو اللي يهمكم في الكلينيكال, كله مهم. All of it is important. Otherwise, I'm wasting my time here. You see, Noor? So I didn't spend 8 hours, 16 hours talking to you to tell you what I'm telling you is not important. It is all important, and you will probably see some of this in your clinical practice. أما كيف تنجح في الامتحان, it's your job, okay? Doesn't mean that I'm not happy to do a review session. But a review session, I'm not going to be the one initiating the questions. You need to sit down and ask questions. بناء على دراستكم, مش أنا راح أحكي لكم شو تدرسوا. Got the point? I'll be happy to do it. But it's not me initiating that. It's you telling me, what did you not understand? بناء على دراستكم وقراءتكم.
طيب دكتور فهمت عليك، ولا يزال يعني الفكره موجوده زي ما حكينا. بنعمل محاضره مراجعه لو ما كان فيها تركيز امور في النهايه، لو طالب بده يراجع بده يسال الى اخره، بكون برضه ممتاز.
والله I'll be happy to if you want to guys. بس كمان مرة رجاء يعني let's make it very clear. I'm not going to tell you anything about what to focus on. All right? You should have heard that in the lectures. كل المادة مهمة. بديش أحكي لكم كل الشابترز مهمة, لأنه أنا مش عم بطلب منكم تحفظوا الشابترز. Okay? If you heard what I was saying during the lectures, I want you to understand the concepts. That's again why I'm here. مش راح تطلعوا neuroscientists بناء على الكورس. You're not even close to finishing the very basics here. Okay? So that being said, yeah, let me know. I'll be happy to review it. But at the same time, إذا كان طريقة التفاعل is basically 4-5 أشخاص اللي بيحكوا معي basically أو بردوا على أسئلتي خلال المحاضرة, then it's disappointing. Okay? So that being said, بعرفش مين ممثل الدفعة عندكم. You let me know, and we can schedule something. من خلال you talk to the course coordinator, and they can let me know as well. All right?
خلاص ان شاء الله بنضل نتواصل دكتور.
Absolutely, happily. الله يعافيك, and نتمنى التوفيق للجميع في نهاية المحاضرات. I hope that actually you guys learned something new today and in the previous days. And again, تركزوش على الامتحان كثير. Okay? الموضوع مش بس الامتحان. الموضوع is about the journey, about the experience, about what you try to learn here. Maybe ممكن يكون مفيد لكم. ممكن بعضكم يصير neuroscientist in the future, or neurologist, or psychiatrist, or anything in that kind of domain. فبناء على هذا الكلام بتمنى التوفيق للجميع. And I'll be more than happy to answer any questions, not in this course only, but beyond. So you let me know if I can be of any help to you now or anytime in the future. يعطيكم العافية والسلام عليكم.
العافية دكتور.